All right. Andrew, welcome back, man. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, kind of a celebration. You have some good news to share that I think is really, really cool. But I'll let you have the floor.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm really excited. I think last time I was on, we talked a little bit about my Thomas Caine thriller series, which is a spy thriller series. And I'm stoked to announce that I signed a publishing deal for those books with a publisher called Boldwood Books. They're based in the UK and they specialize in like thrillers and mysteries and, more, I think, kind of psychological thrillers, but they're trying to move into like the action and spy thriller genres. And they reached out to me and they seemed like really cool people. And we talked back and forth for a while and we made a deal. So they're going to be relaunching all those books starting in May. I'm not exactly sure when this will air, but hopefully somewhere around there.
Yep.
And leading up to a brand new Kane novel that I'm working on now. So it's a really exciting time, and I'm really stoked to be working with them.
So we'll get Tokyo Black first. Or will they come out in increments, or are they all the previous ones gonna kind of drop, and then you'll get new ones?
They're gonna stagger them like so. I think Tokyo Black comes out in May, and then I believe they're coming out monthly, roughly. After that, so there'll be pre-orders up for the next one as each one drops. All leading up to the new one, which is supposed to come out, I believe, somewhere around November of this year.
Nice and nice. And what's the new one called?
Working title, it's not 100%, but the working title is White Tiger.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. So
Has to, I won't go into too much detail, but it has to do with the villain. So.
okay. So how did that kind of partnership come to be? Did they find you? Did somebody get one of your books in their hands, or how did it happen?
It's funny. I honestly don't know like how I got on their radar. They just said like, hey, we were looking at different thriller authors and you had a lot of great reviews and you sell well, and that, somehow I got on their radar. I don't know if someone recommended me to them. I don't know, how many authors they're looking at. I do know a couple other authors that are working with them that I didn't find out were working with them until after the fact. I'd already known them before. So clearly they were making a big push into that area. But, I've, I've had publishers reach out to me before. And for whatever reason, it just never felt like a good fit. I do enjoy self-publishing, and I do think that for some people that is a better route, self-publishing. Like there's definitely pros and cons both sides. But
Sure.
there were a few things about Boldwood that really appealed to me. Number one, I just really liked them. After we had several Zooms and calls, and I just really got along well with them, which of course is important. But also, a lot of indie publishers, I think, are completely 100% Amazon focused, which obviously makes sense. I mean, Amazon's the big dog, but and Boldwood is super Amazon focused as well. But they are wide. They are putting me on other stores as well as Amazon, in addition to Kindle Unlimited, and even some physical bookstores. I think mostly in Europe. So those were avenues that I didn't really have access to as a self-publisher. So
Yeah.
for me, like, what, this is an interesting possibility, and I think I'm going to give it a shot. So
Well, and
we'll
that's
see how it works.
important because you're right. Like a lot of the indie publishers focus on like Amazon because Amazon's perfected that method of indie and independent and self-publishing. They have a
Mm.
system that works very well, and it's proven to work very well for a lot of people, and it's put a lot of books out there. But there's some people who are anti Amazon. They will not feed the monster because they say it's just a big corporate greed, blah blah blah. And but if you go, there's books that are sold everywhere.
Yeah.
Airports, Target, Barnes and Nobles are still around. There's smaller bookstore chains. There's mom and pop bookstores. And I think Amazon's great. It's great for book sales. It really is. But there's so many more outlets out there, and I think it's obviously costs money to cast your net that wide. But people who look at it, I was talking about this with someone the other day. Um, Targeted marketing. Targeted. You put your book. If your book is about hunting and fishing, it's a hunting and fishing thriller. Where do you need to go? You need to go not to the people who are going to buy those kinds of books. You want to go there, but not necessarily exclusively. you want to maybe go to a hunting and fishing expo. Maybe find your way into a local hunting shop or sports goods store, where you put yourself in front of the eyes of people who would maybe be interested in you, but aren't because they don't know you.
Right.
And it's kind of changing up that way of marketing. And the more and more I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's the future. And like, guys like Mark Greaney, he goes to SHOT Show every year, and
Right.
he doesn't need any help selling books, but he gets out there in front of the people who are buying his books and talking about the subjects that are in his books, and he's keeping that fan base and even broadening it at times.
Yeah, and I think that, mentioning Mark and that kind of marketing, I think that like when you're an indie publisher, you're running advertising, like that's one kind of marketing, and it's very hard to find time to do other kinds of marketing, like you're saying, like getting out there and finding new places to new eyeballs to get in front of, new ways to market
Yeah.
your book. Like running, if you're writing books on your own and running ads on your own, that's a lot of work. So by working with a publisher, they're taking over kind of that ad section, which frees me
Yes.
up to reach out to people like you and other podcasts and try to market myself in other ways, and get the word out there in other ways. And that's also something I was excited to do. So
Well, and you have a Hollywood background that we've established last time we talked, which kind of lends you into the storytelling a little bit. Well, let's focus a little more about the writing process, and kind of how you attack a new story. Whether it's Thomas Caine or another project that you've worked on, that you got hidden in the desk drawer because we all have those. Um, but how do you approach kind of a new storyline?
well, I mean, I think for me, like ideas, a bunch of disparate ideas will kind of be floating around, So for instance, for the new Kane story, I knew I had to come up with a new novel, and the first novel was really born out of my love of Japan. I'd taken a trip to Japan, and it made a huge impression on me. And I'd gone back several times, and I thought, maybe it would be interesting to bring Kane back to Japan, like, and bring some of those characters he met in the very first book when he's at a very different point in his life than he is now. Like, bring some of those characters back, maybe a little bit of a reflection, almost like a mirror to that first story. So that was one part of it. And then having visited Japan, I went to new cities and new areas, and I was like, I wanted to work those locations in. I also really, locations are a big source of inspiration for me, like the feel of a city, the vibe of a cafe or a bar. I'm like, oh, this would be a great location. One of my books, almost the entire book grew around when I walked around the lake in the middle of Hanoi.
Mm.
And I remember there was a festival going on, and these kids were playing this game where they're like pounding sticks on a ground, and it's almost like hopscotch where you have to jump through these sticks and they're moving them around. But so everywhere you walked around this lake, you just heard this crack, crack, crack of these sticks like over and over. And I was like, oh, this would make a great like tense scene where he's following somebody. You just hear the beat of these sticks as like almost like a soundtrack. And the whole book kind of grew from that. That was that particular book. So there's all these ideas floating around. And so when I sit down and it's like, okay, now I need to write, I kind of follow like a screenwriting process, because I wrote screenplays before I wrote novels. And so for me, for a screenplay, I kind of collected all those ideas and I start writing them down on note cards, just very anything, like chase scene around lake, action scene in a hotel, whatever comes to mind. And then I start kind of like looking at them and trying to put them in some sort of order. Like, well, okay, like if he has a scene here, what brought him to this location? And then I'll write that down. And once I've got about maybe 20 or 30 of those cards and I can kind of flip through them, I can see the story starting to take shape. And from there, I used to do like a very detailed scene by scene outline, especially when I was first starting writing, because I had a really hard time kind of translating that screenplay structure to a novel structure. Now that I've done it, multiple times, I'm a lot looser, but I'll still write down the kind of main beats, like, okay, act one is about this. And when this happens, we transition to act two. And act two deals with this part of the story, and here's the midpoint. And when this happens, we're transitioning to act three, and here's the climax. These kind of general beats, like a roadmap almost.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I have that, I'm usually pretty much good to go. I start writing. I'll one thing I don't do that a lot of people do is I don't write really extensive character bios. I know a lot of people love to do that, but for me, it kind of has to all come from my head. You know, like if I write it down, I inevitably wind up kind of scrapping that in the writing process anyway, and because I feel like the character and the story are intertwined, so one has to serve the needs of the other. You know, so as I'm writing the story, the characters just come to me, and sometimes I'll go back and change things. Like I'll be like, oh, it would work better if this character was more like comic relief. You know, and I'll go back and tweak their scenes.
Sure.
But most of it, I'd say, it just comes from as I'm writing the needs of the story and like what feels right.
Yeah, I think for me, character bios are more of like an afterthought. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing that after I've established a lot of the story, or while I'm establishing it. It's more of like a note as opposed
Right.
to an actual like something I'm following. Maybe a
So
couple little details, but like the quirks and stuff that you find along the way, I'm writing them down because I can't remember it.
right. Yeah. No, I'll make like bullet points. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah,
don't
yeah.
forget this character smokes this brand of cigarette. Like, I'll do stuff like that. But
Exactly.
yeah, I don't really sit down and write like a start to finish bio. You know, and a lot of people do, and that works for them. I think the interesting thing is how different everyone's process is. You know.
Yeah, I think the one common thing that I've found is that there's not a lot of people that at least I've interacted with in kind of that military thriller, action, adventure, spy genre. Is that not a lot of people are really hardcore dedicated to a plan. That
Mm-hmm.
outline is not really, really rigid. The only one I've heard that's pretty rigid about it is Kyle Mills. And
Right.
that he'll write a very lengthy 20, 30,000 word outline, and that's a lot of an outline. That's a
Yeah.
third of a book. That's a
Yeah. It's a
quarter of a
novella.
book.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a novella, yeah. And so, but a lot of other people are like, kind of like what you did. They get some note cards out, they get some paper out, they get a Word document out, and it's 1 or 2 pages, a couple thousand words, and then that's the story. And then they start writing, and then they start running with it, and it evolves along the way, and they just kind of don't stop that sometimes, and
Yeah.
and just see what happens. You have a start, a middle, and an end maybe, and then you kind of just let the keyboard fill in the gaps.
And sometimes too, I'll be like, okay, here's where I should, go to a subplot scene, but I'm really interested in this main scene, so I'm just going to keep going, and I'll just put in a placeholder, and then I'll go back and write that other scene, or I might write like a couple sentences, like, hey, here's where the CIA chief reveals some new info, that'll
Mm,
come into play.
yeah,
But I don't. It just depends. Sometimes that will interest me and I'll write it, but other times, like, no, I want to stick with my main guy right now and just keep going. And sooner or later, I know I'll go back and fill it in.
yeah.
But it's the funny thing to me was I did so on my very on Tokyo Black and like the first two or three after that, I did write not a 20,000 word, but a pretty detailed outline where it was like chapter by chapter. Here's what happens, and I did it because like I had a really hard time. So I understood screenplay format, and screenplay format it uses three acts, but you're kind of. I always look at it as the screenplay is anchored in time, right? Because each page equals a minute of screen time, and a movie can only be so long. So you've sort of got like a set length, and different genres will have different lengths. Your average horror movie is shorter than your average action movie, so those scripts will be shorter.
Hmm.
So you kind of know, like, okay, I've got maybe 90 to 100 pages, and I'm on page 20. So if I'm not moving into Act Two, I've got a problem. So you have that roadmap kind of just based on what page you're on. And that doesn't really apply to novels, because a reader can put down and pick up a novel whenever they want, and it's not like they're going to sit there in a theater watching it, you would the way you would a movie. So I sort of struggled to transpose that three-act structure from screenplays into novels. And the way I did it was I literally took like one of my screenplays and I was like, all right, like here's where this happens on this page, and a novel's roughly 90,000 words. So like, and I was doing all this math, and I was like, all right, so like at 3,000 words that's this point, at 50,000 words that's this point, and like kind of like
Yeah,
reverse engineering it. And so I was super specific, but what I found was that I diverged completely from that outline. So I started writing like the whole story changed. Like at one point every character in that outline, like I always joke, but it's true, like they were all scheduled to die, and almost none of them did, because I ended up liking them too much, or I got interested in them and like just shuffled things around and things kept changing. So like after that experience 2 or 3 times, I was like, all right, I think I can keep it looser. I don't need to worry so much about that like minutia of exactly when certain things happen.
Yeah. I think when I first started writing fiction, I'm a very organized guy. So I write things down. I have a whiteboard here to keep track of all the podcast stuff. I do the same thing at work. I'm religious when it comes to sticky notes. Like if I don't write it down, I can't see it visually, then I'm going to forget it. Like that's just me. I tried to do that with fiction writing. I tried to be very disciplined and do a long outline, chapter by chapter, act by act. That way I could circle back, I could visualize it, right? Horrible job. It was just a train wreck of a book. But it really made me realize like I was stovepiping myself because I was
Yeah.
trying to put myself in a box and telling myself, stay in the box so you don't go off the rails. Well, I think off the rails is where creativity lies.
Yeah.
And I
But
was
what's
just stopping that.
but what's funny is that may work perfectly well for someone else. It's
Yeah.
all everyone's mind is different. We all approach these things differently. But I was like you. I started to be like, I'm doing all this work. I know I'm going to diverge from it anyway. So really, why am I? It's kind of at that point, it just felt like putting off writing, because it's like all this is going to change. So I just need the key beats. I know the locations in the story. So as long as I know how he gets to each location and kind of more or less what happens there, that's all I need. And
Yeah.
kind of.
That's why I use Scrivener, because Scrivener is just good enough for me to be organized enough, but flexible enough to where I can move chapters around. I can still have my notes. It's just organized enough to, I guess, satisfy that,
Totally.
side of me.
And the thing I love about Scrivener is you can see. So I organize my chapters in Scrivener. And for those who don't know what we're talking about, Scrivener is a piece of writing software
Yes.
that lets you kind of organize chapter and scene specifically. And so what I love is that you can just look on that left hand side. You can see like Act One and all the chapters in Act One, and Act Two, all the chapters in Act Two. If that's how you organize your document.
Mm-hmm.
So I can always see like the marker, like, oh, I'm coming up to the act break. More roughly, you can always shift things around, but it kind of me. It's a roadmap of where I'm at, which I find super useful. I don't know how. I know a lot of guys who do it, guys and gals, but I don't know how people write books in Word. Like it just
I
doesn't
don't
make
either.
sense.
But I know
I
so
can't.
many people who do. And I'm like,
Yeah, a lot of people do, but for me, it doesn't work. Yeah, I love.
what do you do when you need to find something? And they're like, oh, just Control F. I'm like, no, like that's, I don't understand that. But then you find out that some of these guys are on the New York Times bestseller list using Word, and I'm like, I mean, it's not wrong.
No,
It's
it
not
works for them.
wrong, but it works for them. I like Scrivener just because not only can you do that roadmap, but you can add notes, you can drop website links, even like pictures and things like that into scenes,
Yeah.
so that file becomes so much. There's so much life that can come into the book there, and I just like that because again, going back to what I said earlier, I don't like to have to remember everything, and I'm really,
Yeah.
really bad at it. And I think that's the part of me that really helps out because like I don't need to remember it. I've got my notes.
You got it down. Yeah. Whenever new writers, when they talk to me, I always say just check out Scrivener. Like if you don't like it, it's a free trial. You don't have to use it, but at
Yeah.
least look at it before you start because it could save you a lot of headaches.
Oh
Down the
yeah.
road.
And I think a lifetime license is
Oh,
like $50. Yeah,
yeah,
I
so cheap.
mean, yeah, it's super easy and it's very, 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 very convenient. Let's talk about how do you, as a spy thriller author, build suspense? And let me get a little more specific. How do you build it at the right moments so that people aren't hooked on the dialogue as much as they're hooked on the scene and what's happening, not necessarily around them in the exact moment?
Right. It's fun. I've had people ask me that question before, and I don't think I have a great answer. I'll try to answer it as best I can. I think a lot of it comes from when you're. I mean, I'm a natural film and story buff. I've read spy novels and watched spy movies and thrillers and horror movies and suspense movies like my whole life. Just nonstop, like since I could read. Like I read all the James Bond books when I was an early teenager, and I was reading like Hardy Boys before that. And so I think a lot of it is just sort of ingrained. You kind of have this sense of pacing in your head of like, I can draw this out up to here, and then I either need to cut away to something else, or I need to pay it off, or else the audience is going to be pulled too far. Some of that I think is just internalized. But two things that I think help, I think, and this is maybe a weird answer, but to me, a lot of suspense comes down to the location. And when I say that, it's because the location has a mood and a vibe, And so if you can make the location, like when I'm writing about Japan, like Japan is like these dark alleys and neon signs, and everything's just a little bit different. Like the streets are a little bit narrower than they are in the U.S., and so like your character might just feel a little bit off kilter, and not quite sure where you're going. Did you make a wrong turn? Like, is this going to get you where you need to go, or did you go down a bad alley? Like things like that. I try to use the location and how it makes the reader and the character and the scene feel. And so, like as an example, the very opening of Tokyo Black, you're following this guy. He's a Japanese guy. He's in like a coat and a hat, and he's in a dark alleyway. And just the way it's written, like there's something like surreptitious going on. You can tell he's sneaking, And he's in this seedy area, so I pull in all these details of like this red light district and the strip clubs he's going by, and you just know like something's gonna happen. And so like you kind of feel like, oh, is this guy like an assassin, or is he gonna kill somebody? But what he's actually doing is he's just a businessman, and he's going to cheat on his wife, like at a club, in the area. But the way it's all described and the kind of the mood of the environment that he's in starts to build you like, oh, what's going to happen here? Because that location gives you all this potential of stuff that could happen. So, I mean, that's why I think location is so important to me, to stories, and it kind of gives you this canvas of like what might happen in this place, And so to me, that suspense is a natural outgrowth of that. And then related to that, I don't know if this is the same thing, but this is more sort of action. But I do think suspense kind of plays a part in action. Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that I would read in thrillers that would kind of bother me is like I would read thrillers that were very realistic, but like, the hero's chasing the villain and he chases him up to the roof of a building and he shoots the guy and the guy falls off the building and that's the end. And like, to me, that felt very unsatisfying, and certainly uncinematic, like maybe it's realistic, but it doesn't paint much of a picture in your head. It's not very exciting. You've seen that a million times. Mm-hmm. So I always feel like to build suspense in an action scene, like you have to keep escalating things. So like, to me, I would write that scene where he chases the guy up to the building, and then the guy jumps over to the next building. And then the hero's like, oh shit, can I make that jump? Like, that's pretty far, almost like Vertigo, Hitchcock. And maybe the hero chases after him and he doesn't make the jump and he falls on a fire escape, but he like crashes into the building. So now he's running underneath the guy and seeing him through the skylights, and like, how can you take this scene and build it like one step more, and then one step more, and then one step more? And, obviously without getting too ridiculous, or unless, depending on the genre and what you're going for, But like, I think a lot of people kind of end it too early, and whereas the suspense and the excitement and the sense of danger, and like, oh my God, like how much farther is this guy going to go, comes from like trying to like find what's the next level, like where can I take this scene and keep it going and make it more dangerous, more scary,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I like the false flag kind of thing, like what you're saying earlier. Because you can take a dark alley, a guy in a trench coat and a hat, we've seen that a million times too. But the difference is, it's not what you think it was. So you're leading up to it and you think that, and then it gets ripped away from you. But then as a reader, it kind of makes you question everything. Like, I don't know when that's going to happen to me again. So it's just that off kilter questioning that then makes you go, you've almost like artificially implanted the suspense, what I mean? In a way where now you're in the reader's head a little bit. And that changes the dynamic of how they flip to the next page.
You articulate it much better than I could. I think that's, like I said, a lot of technique for writers, I think, is just like the things you've read and the things you've immersed yourself in, and it sort of becomes instinctive at a certain point, which is why I think, if you want to be a writer, I think reading is the most important thing you can do.
Yeah, because you got to pick up on those nuances, man. Like, sometimes you're your hero's got to have a line that he won't cross.
Right.
Even the most badass, heroes got to have maybe that little thing that they won't go there. And then the rooftop scene becomes a lot differently because maybe they're not that brutal. I mean, maybe they've killed some people, but they've killed some people by, they're an operator. They're a military operator. They shoot guns. They take down bad guys. But pushing a guy off a roof is a different psychological thing.
Sure.
That's more murder. And you have a hero who maybe has a conscience where he looks at it like bad guys deserve to die. They deserve to feel pain. Blah blah blah. But yeah, I'm not justice in the manner of pushing this guy off the building.
Right.
So I think those things in there kind of throw a dynamic in there and go, oh well, yeah, well, why would he do that? And then you get to learn a little bit more about the character, almost on accident, and
Yeah.
then it helps, give layers to the story.
I think that's, yeah, exactly. And that's where I feel like character and story are sort of enmeshed, right? You can't quite separate them. Like, obviously, one character can go on to different stories, but every story that character's in is revealing different things about him, and they
Mm-hmm.
play off each other. One of my books, so the character of Caine, he's a badass assassin, but he's also human, and he's he has a lot of doubts because he knows that some of the stuff he did in the past, he found out that the person he was working for, betrayed him and was not, a good guy. And he's like, oh man, like all that stuff I did, like I thought he thought he was making the world a better place. And he's kind of forced to realize that might not be true. So he doubts himself fairly often. And one of the books, he's fighting in a East African war zone. And he's getting pinned down by these snipers, and he's trying to like find a new position, and these soldiers are coming towards him, and he like steps out in the street and he's about to start shooting when he realizes that they're child soldiers. They're just kids like with guns, and he just freezes, like, and he's totally in that moment willing to let them shoot him, but he just can't fire back. And like, to me, that's certainly not something that was outlined or planned, but I was just like, what could I face this guy with that would really phase him, that would stop him? And that was what came to mind, and it fit, what was happening. And I think that's one of the most powerful scenes in the book. So,
Well, it's those moments that I think define characters because he either doesn't shoot the child, who's obviously a danger, or he does.
yeah,
And then that defines that person. That's a memory that a reader's not going to lose. They're
right,
going to remember that, and that defines the character for the reader, regardless of whether you want it to or not. So if you move forward and it's against that or for it, it really helps. Character development, pushing the story forward. I think one of the best kind of examples of that is the Punisher and kind of how they've used him in the movie and the show adaptations is that it's a lot more psychological, and that's something that John Bernthal has said lately, the guy who plays the most current Punisher, is that Frank Castle's, it's a lot more psychological where he's at, as opposed to just the straight up the violence and the justice that he's carrying out. And I think that's a very cool dynamic to show that there's broken people out there that can still focus on their goal or their mission or whatever it may be. But there's layers to characters, and I think that's super super important because you want them to love the character so that they definitely flip the pages and they definitely want to buy the next book, because
right,
they don't fall in love with the characters. What is their investment?
yeah, 100%. And also, I think you run the danger of, obviously these characters are highly competent. They're fictional characters, and they do things that most of us probably really couldn't do in real life. But
Mm-hmm.
you run the danger of dehumanizing them, right? Like, I mean, if they're just
Yes.
too perfect and too badass, that's cool up to a point, but at a certain point, it becomes unengaging. Like,
Yeah.
I always use the example, actually. So, like, I grew up in the '80s, and the big action stars were Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal. And I never really liked Steven Seagal because he never took a hit in his movies. Like, he would just go through and just wipe the floor with everybody, to the point where you're like, well, obviously none of these people pose a threat to this dude at all.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Van Damme would get the crap kicked out of him, but then he'd always rise up at the end, and win, which to me was a much more engaging story. So
Well, yeah, and like the new Reacher season, there's a really really big guy in the new Reacher season that dwarfs Jack Reacher, and like the whole time, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away to anybody, but the whole time you're just kind of wondering when are these two going to go at it, and how bad is Reacher going to get his butt whooped before he tries to bounce back, and it's just
Right.
that lingering question the whole time that really makes you just anticipation.
Yeah.
Too is really cool because it's a great season. By the way, if you haven't watched it yet,
I've been. I'm caught up. Super stoked for the next one.
yeah,
Great series. You know what? Totally random thing, but I just happened to see an interview with the actress who's playing the DEA agent on that show. She's British. Like I would have never guessed. Like,
right. And
yeah.
people who you know you know, I underestimate acting sometimes because these folks can really put it on when they need to and have an American accent. And she has a very almost Italian, New Yorker, Boston.
Yeah, because I think they're in Maine. I want to say, or
Yeah,
but yeah,
it's
it's
a
New
very
England.
heavy East Coast, New England, accent to her, and she does it well. And it's 'cause she's got the snappy attitude that goes with it. So to hear that she's British is crazy.
Yeah,
I
fun
did not
show.
know that.
Everyone should watch it if they haven't checked
Yes.
it out.
So let's talk. Let's talk. This big question. I mentioned it to you earlier before we got online. Amazon recently bought the James Bond series, and I think everybody's got kind of an opinion about it and kind of wondering what was going to happen next. And I read in an interview that the kind of the developer who was behind it before Amazon bought it said the reason why there's not a James Bond after Daniel Craig is because they haven't found the right actor and they haven't found the right story, and they're not just going to make a James Bond movie to get ticket sales and make money. They're going to do it because it all fits and it lines up. And now Amazon has acquired it. So I think a lot of people are going, oh, Amazon's just going to push it into, a TV series. They're going to start cranking out Bond movies because Amazon's they're in the money business. They want to make money. What are your thoughts behind Amazon as a studio now taking on such an
Well,
iconic franchise?
it's I mean, it's a double-edged sword. First of all, like I will say that any of those big giant, and I'm a huge, obviously a huge Bond fan. I've got a Italian Goldfinger poster behind me. I grew up reading those books, watching those movies. I write the books I write partly because of how much I loved James Bond growing up. So definitely means a lot to me. Definitely something I was paying a lot of attention to. But I think the first thing you have to keep in mind is on any huge IP like that, like Star Wars, Marvel, James Bond, you're never going to make everybody happy no matter what you do. Like
Oh
there's
yeah,
tons of people out there that hate the Daniel Craig movies. There's tons of people out there that hated the Pierce Brosnan movies. So whether they reboot it again, with the original rights holders or Amazon, like someone was not going to be happy no matter what they did. Remember when they cast Daniel Craig, everyone was upset, and they didn't
yeah,
think and then he wound up being, I thought, fantastic.
yeah. I thought he's been
Um,
great.
yeah, I mean, like all of them, he had some good movies, some not so great movies, but overall, I thought he did a great job. So Amazon, the only thing about Amazon to me that bugs me is that I don't know that they've had a really serious success with a big IP like that yet. I mean, they did. Trying to think of other things they've done, like in that league, they did the Rings of Power series, which I haven't seen, but a lot of people that I know have watched it didn't particularly like it.
Yeah,
They did the Jack Ryan series, which was fun but kind of hit or miss. I like what they've done with the Reacher series a lot, but I don't
yeah.
know if that's on the same scale. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, I want it to be good. I'll be rooting for them. I hope they do a good job with it. But I think one thing that kind of, again, for all of those IPs that's a serious risk is like overexposure. Like, I mean, when I grew up, Star Wars was the biggest thing ever. And if
Hmm.
you told 6 or 7 year old me that one day I'd be kind of sick of Star Wars, I would have thought you were crazy. I mean,
Yeah,
like, what way? But after like, back then, a Star Wars movie came out every 3 years, and it was like a major event when it happened. Now it was like every year we got a Star Wars movie, a bunch of Star Wars TV shows, Star Wars cartoons, And I think it just stopped being special, like it's
Yeah,
just sort of like anything else. And I think if they do that with Bond, and there's like, okay, yeah, there's the movies, but then there's also the TV show and the spin-off characters and standalone movies separate from the other movies. Like I think they run the risk of the same thing happening.
agreed.
So if it were me, I think the IP is valuable. Like, but I mean, it already made billions of dollars just making one movie every 2 or 3 years.
Hmm.
So if it were me, that's what I would keep doing and just try to make the best ones you can. Like, you're never going to make everyone happy, and it's certainly going to be a tough act to follow the Daniel Craig ones. But do the best you can and make as many as you can. And then like the great thing about Bond is it's one of the few properties that people just expect to reboot. I mean, it's like everyone knows that sooner or later they'll recast Bond. It's happened 6 times or whatever. So,
Yeah.
you do it for a while and then you try again. It can go forever if you don't burn people out on it. So,
Well, there's no timeline. I think that's important too for Bond. It doesn't necessarily feel like there's a timeline. Obviously, they've kind of tried to keep to the same age, of the actor that they've casted. So I think going too far on a departure of that, too young or too older, could throw people off a little bit. But I think the fact that there's no timeline and that when we get a new Bond movie, you're not concerned about, well, when does this take place in the
right.
timeline?
It's
It's
always
not.
just, like,
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's something that Marvel goofed up on when they started getting big and they started saying we're going to do Marvel TV and start doing some of those smaller stories that fans want to see, but we're going to intertwine it with the larger universe. And I'm like, well, that's where you made your mistake. You
right.
know, you tried too hard to tie it all together, and then you lost the intent of pleasing the fan base and
Yeah.
giving them a Daredevil, giving them a Punisher, and some of these smaller, I say smaller stories, but stories that are not going to fit on the big Avengers silver screen, you know.
Sure.
And I think, and you, having experience in that realm, sometimes less is more. So you got to scale it a little bit. So I really hope that with James Bond, they don't go, let's go all in and let's do some spin-offs and all that stuff. Like, whoa, 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 whoa. Sometimes, like you said, less is more. Every 2 to 3 years, you get something big and people really dive and invest into it. And that's
Yeah,
like,
then they're stoked to see it, not
yeah.
like, oh, I watched this last week. Why do I need to see it again? Like,
Yeah, don't give me the option to not watch it.
yeah,
Don't give me something else I could watch instead. That's what streaming services have done. Like, there's so many options out there to where, I haven't caught up on this series because I've been watching this series. I'll get to it
yeah,
eventually.
yeah, exactly.
Make me
But
hungry for it.
what I think might be interesting with Amazon, I wonder if they would ever consider buying the rights to the literary series, and then they could fill in the gaps because it's two different right holders. The movies and the literary are two separate people, groups, or entities that hold those rights. So if they bought that, then they could do the movies, have the books come out in between, and keep interest alive that way. And that would make a lot of sense. Being Amazon, I mean,
Yeah,
they're the biggest seller in the world. So
yeah. Well, let's talk Thomas Caine and this new kind of lease on life that it's got with your new publisher and re-releases and what's going on in the future. So how's the rest of this year pave out for Thomas Caine, and then what's the future projects look like?
well, it's a multi-book deal. So they'll be publishing all of the originally published novels. Let's see, I got to count it myself. There's one, two, three, four. Totally Black, Red Phoenix, Fire, Forget, Code Green. So there's four existing novels, and then we're also combining two novellas that were previously published into a single book because it's kind of part one and part two of one story. So we're just putting them together as one book. So five existing novels starting in May. They're relaunching those books with new covers, new editions, new audiobooks. Each one, I mean, they've all been edited, but a new kind of edit pass just to catch anything that slipped through the cracks. And tiny minor updating occasionally where needed. Like I think one of the books, just because of when it was published, like I aged up the villain a little bit to make it current. Stuff, little tiny tweaks like that, but nothing major. All And so those will all be leading up to the publication of the sixth book in November. And then I am terribly, unlike you, I'm terribly disorganized, so I don't have all the dates. But I'm contracted for three more books after that. But
Okay.
I don't have all the dates in my head. But obviously, I don't think we'll be able to keep going monthly after that. So I assume the pace will slow down a little bit since those haven't been written yet. And I'm sure some of them will be Caine books, but they don't all have to be Caine books. So it's possible I might do like maybe two or three Caine books and maybe one or two other things, some of which might be related to Caine, some of which might be brand new. I can't go into too much detail, but I do have other ideas for other series in the genre, some of which follow other characters and some of which are just their own complete new thing. So we'll have to see, but clearly, definitely keep me busy well into 2026. So
Nice. Hey, that's good. So
yeah,
give me a good 30 second to 1 minute breakdown of Tokyo Black for those who maybe don't know it, and why they should read it.
sure. So Tokyo Black it's a kind of an action-y spy thriller. I'd say think something like a Jason Bourne kind of story, and it follows Thomas Caine, who when we meet him is kind of living off the grid under an assumed identity in Thailand. And we know that he was betrayed by the CIA and that he was framed for this operation that went bad. His partner was killed, and like the rest of the world basically thinks that A, Caine is dead, and B, Caine betrayed his partner and tried to like make off with some money, and that he's the reason the operation failed. None of which is true. And Caine doesn't really go to try to get revenge on the people that did betray him because his lover, who also works for the CIA, he's worried that if he shows up again, they'll target her because they know that he has, is connected to her. So he basically just was like, I'm just going to drop off the grid. But then a situation happens in Japan, and Caine has this experience of having worked undercover in Japan, and his old superiors find out that he is alive, and so they essentially blackmail him. He winds up in like this brutal Thai prison, and they're basically like, "We'll bust you out if you go do this job for us in Japan."
Mm.
So he does, and that kind of kicks off this. He's basically trying to find this missing girl. Like, she's the daughter of a important Japanese CIA asset that they're trying to keep happy. But as he pursues her, he winds up uncovering this bigger plot that obviously I don't want to reveal. But it's a very kind of action packed book. It's got a little bit of a noir feel because of the Tokyo environment,
Yeah.
and a lot of readers really love the setting, and that if you read the reviews, you'll see people talk about the setting and how it feels very real, and they feel like they went to Japan, and that was really important to me. Like I said, a lot of it was inspired by what an impression Japan made on me when I visited, and so I really tried to make that come alive in the book. So if you want a kind of interesting location that you don't get to see so much, when I wrote it, also I found a lot of thrillers were so focused on the Middle East, and I kind of wanted to do something different, and that kind of led to most of the Caine books have an Asian setting, just because that's most of my travel has been through Asia. So there's books, in China and Vietnam. This new one takes place back in Japan, also Korea, and it's got a lot of action. It's I tried to make it feel like an action movie. So I remember also when I wrote it, a lot of people were saying like, "Oh, you can't do a good car chase in a book," and I was like, "I don't know about that." And so I gave it a shot, and people seem to really like it. So it's got gunfights, car chases, lots of fighting, big explosive climax, but all I think kind of kept in the realm of believability. It doesn't go into like full Roger Moore James Bond territory where it's like
Hmm.
really out. It's a lot grittier than that, but if you like Ian Fleming's writing, not so much the Bond movies, but if you like Ian Fleming's writing, I think Tokyo Black is something that would appeal to you.
Well, and it's a fresh kind of take on a spy thriller because, again, like you mentioned, a lot of things have been focused on the Middle East, and rightfully so. That was a topic, of it still is, but it was a heavy topic for 20 years while we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, Syria and all of them, it's kind of expanded. But I was talking to a buddy of mine in the publishing industry the other day, and he said that he had heard from a few agents that if your book has anything to do with Russia, they weren't even going to look at it because
Really?
they're just so tired
Uh,
Russians being the bad guys. Like
sure.
that's played out. So unless you're a Mark Greaney or a Brad Thor, somebody who's gonna, he's gonna sell some books regardless of what they put out there. You know,
Right.
you're playing with gasoline and matches. Not in your favor if you're talking about the Russians, but I think
Yeah.
the South China Sea, the Asian part of the world, is an untapped place for stories, especially with the tensions that are going on there now with Taiwan and the South China Sea and China ramping up their military, and we don't know what North Korea is going to do. So I think it's a really cool place, and I love the noir feel of Tokyo Black. I think that's a really cool. I like the feel of noir books. I don't like the lack of action in them sometimes, so I think it's cool to have a mixture of the two in Tokyo Black. But before I let you go, um, spoiler free kind of rundown of what to expect in the new book in November.
So in the new book, Kane is he's working actually in South Korea when he gets a message from from a old friend, for lack of a better word, someone from Tokyo Black who is Japanese and who he owes a great deal to. And in Japan, when you really owe someone, like really owe them, there's this concept called giri, which is like an obligation. It's beyond just like, oh, I borrowed money or something. It's like, no, you owe this person like big time. And this character has done some favors for Kane, and he's essentially calling in those favors. And so Kane has to go to Japan and help him out with a situation involving his family who is in trouble. And so it's there's tensions in the background between South Korea and North Korea and the U.S. And Kane's kind of trying to navigate all that while helping his friend while he's really not supposed to be there. He's kind of operating off the grid again. So that's kind of the basic setup.
And last big question: where can people go to find more about current news and news on the books and kind of how the rest of 2025 is going to go with the new book release?
Well, definitely, you can check out my website, andrewwarrenbooks.com. I'm sure we'll link it somewhere on this.
Yep.
And then also, if you just search my name on Amazon, all authors on Amazon, if you find any author you like, you can always click their name and then follow them, and that really helps out. You'll see any new books they have coming out, any pre-orders they have coming out, and it also kind of shows Amazon that there's interest. So I always appreciate it if people can do that.
Well, Andrew, it's a pleasure, my friend. Thanks for stopping by again. And we'll have to do this again in the fall when the new book comes out and you have a title and a cover and you're really ready to rock and roll on that one for
I would
November.
love that. That would be amazing, man. Thank you so much.
Yes, sir.